In the last two lectures, we talked about Greek heroes. Today, we're going to look at some different figures in Greek mythology, Jason and Medea. Jason is most well known for captaining the Argonauts and for bringing home the Golden Fleece. It's tempting to think of Jason as yet another Greek hero, but by the end of this lecture, I'm betting that you'll think of Jason differently. In a way, Jason is the hero that could have been, but never quite was. And Medea, who's best known for murdering her own children, might surprise you a bit as well. The best-known version of Jason's story is told in the Argonautica, a 3rd century BCE epic poem by Apollonius. Apollonius' story opens with a warning to King Peleus, king of Iolcus on the coast of Thessaly. The poem declares, "Such was the oracle that Peleus heard, that a hateful doom awaited him to be slain at the prompting of the man whom he should see coming forth from the people with but one sandal." The next line of the poem announces that Jason, King Peleus' half-nephew, has arrived, of course wearing only one sandal. The king devises a plot to get rid of Jason, sending him on a long voyage to complete a virtually impossible task, and we're off on a grand adventure epic. Apollonius uses flashbacks to provide the context for all of this. Years previously, Peleus stole the throne of Iolcus from Jason's father, before Jason was even conceived. After becoming king, Peleus slaughtered virtually everyone in the family who might threaten his reign. But for some reason, and we're not told why, he imprisons Jason's father instead of killing him. While in prison, Jason's father marries Alcmede, who becomes pregnant with Jason. Peleus finds out about the pregnancy and plans to murder Jason, but Alcmede tricks Peleus into believing that Jason is stillborn. Then she fakes Jason's burial and she smuggles him to Mount Pelion, where he's raised by the centaur Chiron. The special circumstances surrounding Jason's birth and the fact that he's raised by the wise Chiron, who is actually known for training heroes, are classic signs in Greek mythology that Jason has a special destiny. However, we don't learn these facts from Apollonius until much later. In fact, Apollonius spends hundreds of lines describing the fellow sailors who joined Jason on his epic journey before he tells us anything about Jason himself. And when these sailor warriors choose their leader, they first turn to Heracles, not to Jason. Heracles demurs, and then he turns to Jason. Now, all of this suggests that the story we're about to hear is different from the Odyssey, and our protagonist is also different. Homer was probably writing in the 8th or the 7th centuries BCE. Apollonius was writing at least 4 centuries later, in the 3rd century BCE. Also, while Apollonius was clearly nodding to the Homeric epic poem tradition, his story of the Argonauts has its own personality. In particular, Jason doesn't fit the traditional hero mold. We're told that when Jason becomes a young man, he travels to Peleus' court in order to claim the throne, which Jason should have inherited. According to Apollodorus, Jason loses his sandal in a river because he's in such a hurry. So when Jason first enters Peleus' court, therefore, he's only wearing one sandal. Peleus, of course, remembers the prophecy and immediately sees Jason as a threat. But Jason is his relative, and a whole crowd of people are watching the conversation, so he can't just kill Jason outright. Instead, Peleus becomes devious. He asks Jason, "What would you do if an oracle told you that a certain man was destined to kill you?" Jason is guided in his answer by the goddess Hera, who is actually trying to help him. Jason says, "I'd send him to bring back the Golden Fleece." King Peleus then declares that he will yield the throne to Jason if Jason presents him with the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece has a rich history all on its own. According to the ancient writer Hyginus, Poseidon abducted the nymph Theophany, and he carried her off to an island. There, Poseidon took the form of a ram and he turned the nymph Theophany into a ewe, so that Theophany's other suitors couldn't tell the two of them apart from the surrounding flock. As a result, Theophany gave birth to a ram, a winged ram with golden fleece. Later, this same ram tried to carry Phrixus and his sister Helle, the grandchildren of the first king of Thessaly, across the sea. Unfortunately, Helle fell off and drowned. The ram brought Phrixus safely to Colchis, a far-off exotic island to the ancient Greeks, located on the eastern side of the Black Sea. And in Colchis, Phrixus sacrificed the ram. We never know exactly why King Pelias wants this golden fleece. It may simply be that the golden fleece is associated with power and with authority. It may also be that King Pelias, who is based in Thessaly, believed that the ram's fleece belonged in Thessaly because of its association with Phrixus and Helle. In any case, he's sending Jason to near certain death, and that is the king's primary goal in Apollonius' story. In order to retrieve the fleece, Jason has to sail far from Thessaly to the island of Colchis. Jason gathers a crew of the greatest warriors of his time to go with him in a ship called the Argo. These men, called the Argonauts, are traditionally numbered at 50, and they include the top guns of the ancient Greek mythological world. They include Heracles, Orpheus, and Laertes, the father of Odysseus. Together, these men were considered unstoppable. It's important to get some chronology straight before we go any further. The most important source available for Jason's story is Apollonius' account, the Argonautica, written at least 4 centuries later than the Iliad and the Odyssey. However, Jason's story predates these epic adventures. In other words, even though the story of Jason and the Argonauts was composed several centuries after the Iliad and the Odyssey, the events described in the story occur prior to the great epic adventures. Notice, this puts the author Apollonius in a bit of a bind. He can create new stories about the heroes that appear in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he has to make sure that they end up somewhere that makes sense, given what will occur in these later epics. It's sort of like the Star Wars prequels. You can have all sorts of fun adding new backstories, but in the end, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedis, and the Empire have to end up in the right place. The story of Jason and the Golden Fleece is similar. Jason himself largely fades from Greek mythology after the Argonautica ends, but several of the other characters live on, and Apollonius' myth has to manipulate them properly to set up all the epics yet to come. Now, scholars suggest that Apollonius had other challenges as well. He wrote with a clear nod to an expansive Homeric epic when his contemporaries largely dismissed epics. He actually came to verbal blows with his own teacher, Callimachus, and ultimately Apollonius left the city of Alexandria in a huff, and he traveled to Rhodes. From that time forward, he called himself Apollonius of Rhodes, clearly repudiating the Alexandrian literary scene. Back to our story. Once Jason and the Argonauts set off, they begin a series of wild adventures as they sail in a northeasterly direction toward Colchis. Apollodorus, in his version of the Argonauts' adventures, states that the ship stopped at the island of Lemnos, just off the west coast of modern-day Turkey. The situation on Lemnos was a bit unusual. The women on Lemnos had murdered their husbands. According to the mythology, the women had neglected their proper worship of Aphrodite. As punishment, Aphrodite made them smell absolutely foul, so foul that their husbands wouldn't come near them. Outraged, the women murdered all of the men in their sleep. In another version of the story, the king alone survived, but only because his daughter saved him by putting him out to sea in a sealed chest. When Jason and the Argonauts landed on Lemnos, the women there took the Argonauts as their lovers. Presumably they weren't cursed with that foul smell any longer. Time passed, and the quest for the Golden Fleece seemed forgotten. Together, the women of Lemnos and the Argonauts gave birth to a whole new race of men. Jason himself fathered twins with the queen of Lemnos. But eventually, Heracles persuaded Jason to leave the island, declaring, "No fair renown shall we win by tarrying so long with foreign women, nor will some god seize and give us at our prayer a fleece that moves by itself." Heracles' speech does the trick, and the Argonauts, properly chastened, get back on the ship and continue their journey. After leaving Lemnos, the Argonauts traveled eastward. Just shy of the opening into the Black Sea, they encounter the Dolionese people. The king there, King Cyzicus, directed them to a land beyond Bear Mountain. Unfortunately, the king failed to mention that a race of 6 armed giants lived in this land. Heracles managed to defend the ship from these giants when they attacked, but the Argonauts set sail again as soon as they could. The Argonauts continued toward Colchis. One of the most dramatic moments involved their passage through the clashing rocks. These were huge cliffs that smashed together whenever anyone tried to pass between them. King Phineus, whom Jason had saved previously, instructed Jason to release a dove when the ship drew near to the clashing rocks. If the dove made it through safely, then the ship would pass through safely as well. When Jason released the dove, it survived the flight between the rocks, but as Apollodorus writes, as she flew, the clash of the rocks nipped off the tip of her tail. Similarly, when the Argonauts sailed between the clashing rocks, the rocks managed to clip the stern of the ship. Once the Argonauts passed through, the clashing rocks stayed forever joined, never again to smash a traveler. This adventure is a classic nod to Homer. It can't help but remind the reader of Odysseus' passage between Scylla and Charybdis. I'm struck by the fact that Jason and his companions don't pass through the rocks completely unscathed. Their ship is damaged slightly. For me, this is a metaphor for the entire story. Jason won't survive his quest without a scar, without being damaged physically, emotionally, and morally. All of these journeys, however entertaining, serve as a mere prelude to Jason's test when he finally reaches Colchis. In the ancient Greek world, Colchis was the easternmost site in the known world. It was truly the edge of the earth. It was located just outside the boundaries of the land conquered by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. So when Apollonius writes of Jason arriving there, he's setting Jason and the Argonauts on the very boundary of human society. When Jason arrives in this foreign city, the king, King Aeetes, is antagonistic. The Golden Fleece seems to have remained in Colchis since Phrixus' sacrifice, and it is now guarded by a fearsome dragon. Now, quite understandably, King Aeetes doesn't simply agree to just hand this fleece over to Jason. Instead, he requires Jason to complete a Herculean task. The king orders Jason to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls together and to sow a field with dragon's teeth. And this is where Medea enters the picture. Medea was King Aeetes' daughter, and she was also a sorceress. In the myth, Medea falls in love with Jason. In some versions, this is attributed to Jason's good looks. In Apollonius' account, the goddess Hera persuades Aphrodite to make Medea fall in love with Jason so that she can protect him with her magical powers. In a dramatic moment, Eros, Aphrodite's son, shoots an arrow into Medea's heart, causing her to fall hopelessly in love with Jason. Apollonius writes, Eros laid the arrow notch on the cord in the center, and drawing wide apart with both hands, he shot at Medea. And speechless amazement seized her soul. She kept darting bright glances straight up at Aeson's son, and within her breast her heart panted fast through anguish. All remembrance left her, and her soul melted with the sweet pain. Well, once Medea enters the picture, the story becomes very complicated, and it takes on a different tone. In my opinion, Jason becomes much less sympathetic and, frankly, much less interesting. For me, it's as if you're tuning into the second season of a hit TV series, but the writers used up all their good material for the hero in season number 1. In Colchis, Jason gradually yields the limelight to Medea, who seems to take the driver's seat in terms of moving the plot along. Medea prepares Jason for the trials her father has designed. She warns Jason that the dragon's teeth, when sown into the field, will immediately emerge as full-grown warriors. If the fire-breathing bulls don't burn Jason to death, the armed warriors will slaughter him. Medea provides a magic ointment that protects Jason from the bull's fire. She also instructs Jason to throw a rock into the midst of the armed warriors immediately after they spring from the ground. He does this, and the warriors, not quite knowing where the rock came from, turn against one another, ultimately slaughtering themselves. Medea then uses a magic spell to put the guard dragon to sleep, and Jason steals the golden fleece. Apollonius writes, "At that time did Jason uplift the mighty fleece in his hands, and from the shimmering of the flocks of wool there settled on his fair cheeks and brow a red flush like a flame." At this point, Jason sails back to Greece, taking Medea with him and promising to marry her. Medea's younger brother tries to prevent this, but he is murdered. Some versions claim that Medea dismembers her brother's body and scatters the parts. She does this knowing that her father will stop to collect all of his son's body parts to give him a proper burial, and this will slow down his pursuit of Medea, Jason, and the Argonauts. In some accounts, Medea and Jason visit the island of Circe, the sorceress who kept Odysseus as her captive. Well, Circe is also Medea's aunt, and on this island, Medea is purified from the murder of her own brother. Medea's behavior is horrifying, but Apollonius' story is remarkably free of commentary. If anything, she's portrayed as aiding the forces of good by helping Jason and the Argonauts, despite her extreme methods. The fact that she comes from a remote and a foreign land provides some cover for her outlandish behavior. Also, she's completely overpowered by her love for Jason. In any case, from this time forward, Medea is absolutely single-minded in her devotion to Jason. Jason, Medea, and the Argonauts take a very circuitous route home, including travels through modern-day Eurasia, along the western coast of Italy, across the Mediterranean, a brief stint in northern Africa, and back across the Mediterranean toward home. Along the way, their troubles continue. At one point, they pass the Sirens in a clear echo of the Odyssey. In the Argonautica, Orpheus plays music to drown out the song of the Sirens. The travelers also encounter the Phaeacians, the same people who hosted Odysseus in the Odyssey. In the Argonautica, the Phaeacians threaten to turn Medea and Jason over to Medea's father's army. King Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, decides that if Medea is still a virgin, she should be returned to her father. But if she isn't, she should remain with Jason as his wife. The king's wife overhears this, and she makes sure that Jason and Medea marry and consummate their marriage. Jason and Medea wed, but Apollonius indicates that this isn't what they wanted. He writes, "Orpheus's harp rang clear, sang the marriage song at the entrance to the bridal chamber. Yet, not in the house of Alcinous was the hero, Aeson's son, minded to complete his marriage, but in his father's hall when he had returned home to Iolcus. And such was the mind of Medea herself, but necessity led them to wed at this time." I take this as a bad sign, foreshadowing a rocky road ahead for the couple. This forced marriage doesn't bode well for the future. Near the end of their voyage, the Argonauts approach the island of Crete. But as they come near, a giant bronze man, Talos, responsible for guarding the island, hurls giant boulders at the ship, attempting to sink it and to kill all on board. Medea comes to the rescue. She kills Talos by withdrawing a nail that is lodged in the single vein that runs from his neck to his ankle. When the nail is removed, Talos bleeds to death. In another version of the journey, an Argonaut actually drives the nail into Talos's vein, but Medea then hypnotizes Talos, driving him insane so that he actually removes the nail from his own vein, whereupon he bleeds to death. Either way, once Talos is dead, the Argonauts land safely on Crete. Apollonius's account of the voyage of the Argonauts ends shortly after this event, somewhat disappointingly. We leave the voyagers on the island of Anaphe, not far from Jason's home, but not quite there yet. Jason and his companions establish a festival honoring Apollo, but Apollonius never quite brings Jason home. I find this disconcerting. We're left with an almost, but not quite, kind of hero story. We know the rest of the story from other sources, including several poems. Once the Argonauts return to Greece, Medea settles down with Jason, but she continues to perform sorcery. In order to punish King Peleus, who refused to relinquish the throne when Jason returns, Medea plots to do away with the king. She tricks King Peleus's daughters, promising them that she can rejuvenate their aging father. To demonstrate, she cuts up an old ram, puts it into a cauldron, and a young lamb magically emerges. Medea promises to rejuvenate King Peleus in a similar way, so his own daughters cut him into small pieces and place his mangled body into Medea's cauldron. Needless to say, Medea doesn't resurrect him. Instead, Jason finally inherits his father's throne, but he and Medea have to flee to Corinth to avoid being punished for King Peleus's murder. Let's take a moment to appreciate all that Medea has done here. Since practically her first meeting with Jason, she has saved his life and the lives of his crew members multiple times. She's left her home country, and she's abandoned her family for him. She's given him 2 sons. She's also performed magic and sorcery on his behalf, even though this marks her as a foreign and a dangerous woman in Jason's home community. And she does all of this out of her love for him. But you just know that all of this is going to end very, very badly. The best-known account of the end of Medea and Jason's relationship was developed by Euripides for his 5th century BCE drama, Medea. In Corinth, Medea hopes to live out her days with Jason. Instead, Jason decides to leave her and to marry Creusa, the daughter of King Creon, the king of Corinth. Now, this is a politically advantageous match, and Jason decides to abandon Medea for the sake of this alliance. Medea confronts Jason when he announces his engagement, reminding him of her loyalty and all that her loyalty has cost her. Jason just throws this back in her face, arguing that Aphrodite caused Medea to fall in love with Jason. So ultimately, Aphrodite is responsible for all the good that came his way. Jason claims that he really owes his gratitude to Aphrodite, not to Medea at all. He steadfastly refuses to express any appreciation for Medea, and at this point, Medea is completely abandoned. Euripides' play provides the definitive version of Medea's outrage at being forsaken. In the play, Medea determines to be avenged. First, she offers Jason's bride-to-be a beautiful dress as a supposed peace offering and a wedding gift. The dress, however, is coated with poison on the inside, and as Jason's bride puts it on, she is burned to death by this poison. As she is dying, her father, King Creon, comes to her aid, but he is also burned to death as he tries to save his daughter. Next, Medea murders her own children, her two sons fathered by Jason. In a dramatic speech, Medea declares that the suffering she will endure is worth the pain in order to wreak revenge on Jason. She states, "I understand too well the dreadful act I'm going to commit, but my judgment cannot check my anger, and that incites the greatest evils human beings do." Jason returns to discover his children slaughtered and Medea about to depart. He begs to be able to bury his children's dead bodies. But Medea declares, "Never. My own hands will bury them. I'll take them to Hera's sacred lands, so no enemy of mine will commit sacrilege against them by tearing up their graves. As for you, you'll have a miserable death, as is fitting for a coward." A little digging reveals that Euripides himself probably invented the storyline about Medea killing her own children. No such episode appears in any earlier version of Jason and Medea's story. In earlier versions, Medea's children were killed by the people of Corinth as punishment for Medea's murder of King Creon and his daughter. Euripides takes Medea to a new level by having her commit the most unnatural act imaginable, murdering her own children as vengeance. And here we come to the core of Medea's character, as understood by Euripides. She cannot forgive being wronged, even when it leads her to murder her own sons. Ironically, this might be the element of the myth that makes it so poignant. Aristotle once said that Sophocles claimed to write about humans as they ought to be, while Euripides wrote about them as they truly were. This is the challenge with interpreting myth. How much should it be seen as elevating the best that we can be, and how much does it reflect the truth of who we really are? In Greek mythology, once Jason betrays Medea, he's completely lost. The goddess Hera, who had protected Jason throughout his life, withdraws her support and protection once she learns of Jason's betrayal. Jason falls asleep in the stern of his beloved Argo, and the old ship, which has fallen into disrepair and completely rotted away, collapses on Jason as he sleeps and kills him. And thus the would-be hero dies an ignominious death, completely alone, abandoned by former friends, family, and the gods, surrounded only by the remnants of his former glory. Jason's story begins with a bang and ends with a whimper. I can't help thinking of Jason as the high school football hero everyone thought would do great. And instead, he shows up at the 25th reunion without a job and all alone. He drinks a little too much, he replays the glory days of his long-ago football career and his romantic escapades, and then he falls asleep in a beat-up '74 Chevy. There was so much promise, and then something went disastrously wrong. Dante goes further when he tells Jason's story. In his poem, The Inferno, Jason appears in the 8th circle of hell, punished for being a seducer. It's important to remember that we've drawn on several ancient literary traditions to tell the complete story of Jason, Medea, and the Argonauts. The Argonautica ends with Jason nearing his homeland, clearly victorious and inaugurating a festival celebration. Part 1 of the story then plays on some common epic themes. The challenge to the hero who travels across the seas to emerge victorious, having established his bona fides as a deserving hero. He's joined by his faithful companions, supported by key gods, and aided by a woman or women who fall in love with him. Part 2 takes a dramatic turn. Upon returning home, the hero's world falls apart, largely because of his own character flaws. One could argue that, as in the Odyssey, Jason's story shows that heroes were just never made for the domestic sphere. They are at their best when adventuring, not at home. At home, they have to face the challenges of their family members, and these often prove much more difficult to handle than any dragons or monsters. In fact, we've seen the Greeks deal with the problem of the hero's return home with several characters, with Heracles, Odysseus, and with Jason. The stories end differently, but all are troubling. Heracles eventually sheds his human aspect and becomes fully divine, but only after his jealous wife burns him to death by mistake. Odysseus returns home humbled, but he gets to put on his warrior persona one more time to reclaim his home and family, and we never really see him take up a quiet domestic life. Jason completely washes out as a landlubber. He loses everything, and he dies in the remains of the Argo. It seems that in Greek mythology, heroes have no place in the real world. I want to close with the image of the golden fleece itself. In Greek mythology, this fleece symbolized a king's authority. But some scholars believe that the mythology of the golden fleece originated in a much more mundane context. In pre-literate times, sheepskins were used to capture flakes of gold from riverbeds, and then they were hung to dry on tree branches. From a distance, the fleece itself appeared to be pure gold. Up close, however, it was just an ordinary fleece, with a few flakes of gold glittering in the sun on a dirty, damp sheepskin. In many ways, this serves as a metaphor for the entire Jason and the Argonauts' adventure. The overall message may be, beware of fleece shimmering like gold. Securing it may cost you more than you know. We know that the Romans conquered Corinth in 146 BCE. At this point, the Greek peninsula effectively came under Roman rule. Much like Jason, Greece begins to age and fade in political importance when the military glory days are past. But Greek culture, especially its mythology, casts a long shadow, living on in Roman culture and shaping Western culture broadly for centuries to come. We'll turn in our next lecture to the Roman world, but we should keep in mind that the culture that gave us Heracles, Odysseus, Jason, and Medea continues on, never slipping away entirely. In fact, as we'll see, the rich mythologies of the ancient Greeks persist into the Roman world, suggesting that they convey messages that transcend the ancient Greek world.